Hello, welcome back to RP-0 America. So we are approaching here. I did a little bit of time warp, of course, to we are now pretty close. We're, alarmingly close, 2.5 kilometers and closing fast. So I really need to turn on these engines now. So you can see with the current thrust of this engine, so you kind of get the option, it would take 12 minutes. There we go. So there was closest approach, and goodbye. So there were small adjustments in how close the closest approach was while approaching. Really had to do this to be able to see how much time it would take in order to complete this burn. So it says about 12 minutes with this engine. So all right, so let's just load up. Go back. Now that I know how long that burn would take, I want to start the burn 6 minutes before closest approach. So that is fair, so I can start doing that. And of course I'll have to use a bit of time warp for that, because a 12-minute burn, it's not the most riveting of times. Alright, so let's see. Closest approach, so let's just see if we can get that a little bit closer without having a major negative impact on relative velocity at closest approach. It looks like we can get within 100 meters. That looks, come on, just a little more. Yeah, that's not bad. All right, so let's just turn that off. So these numbers will adjust a bit. They'll kind of change a bit when I go into time warp. Bring that back up. And the crew has been in orbit for 5 days. In 2 days, they will have, they will be at a new duration record, I believe, 7 days. Which I was also planning for in this mission, which is good. Because even if we fail at the docking and rendezvous, we will still get a new duration mission. So we are 12 minutes away, so awesome. All right, so let me first try just, so keep an eye on, I'm going to at least be keeping an eye on closest approach distance and distance to target. So if I just go to a physical time warp, so those numbers, relative velocity at closest and closest approach. So those numbers don't change if I go into physical time warp. So in theory, I could wait 6 minutes at 4x to get there. So in contrast, if I go here, so it's 120, so that number immediately changed. The closest approach distance was kind of recalculated and changed by me going to time warp 10. And it may change when I come back out of time warp. I don't believe it'll go back to the exact same number, because that changed a bit while I was time warping closer and closer. And I think we're getting to the point where we would be able to see the other craft. I'm not exactly sure. There it is, where it will be relative to us, but it looks like it's there. So I'm going to wait. There we go, 7 minutes. That's good enough since the burn was telling us 6 minutes. 12 minutes total, so let's bracket it with 6 minutes. In practice, that's safe in this case. Like, there's complications of, so if a burn is 12 minutes, half of that is 6 minutes. So you could put half of that burn before, that is the right, before the node and half after, only if your thrust is going to be the same, because you want the same amount of acceleration to have happened, or aggregate acceleration, integrated acceleration, velocity change before and after the node. So normally in a rocket, you're burning a lot of fuel during that burn, which is causing your craft to get lighter, which results in a higher g-force, a higher acceleration during that burn. But in this case, the acceleration, we're not losing very much mass, so it's a much more accurate statement to just bracket that directly, where half of the burn is before and half is after. So because we're doing this so far out, like we're 50 kilometers away still, so it's going to, so our burn is going to, sorry, I bumped my microphone / webcam. So it's going to have a notable difference, because burning from this far in the future from closest approach doesn't approximate very good to the ideal exact instantaneous burn that would happen if we could do that. And so it's going to have an effect here. So I'm going to kind of have to ride this a bit to try to keep that approach distance. I need to figure out basically which direction do I need to burn in order to keep that number from climbing really far away. So I'm willing to let it get to say 500 meters as an example. I'll try to keep an eye out, because I don't want to actually sit outside of any kind of time warp for this whole period of burn. And so I'm willing to let it wander out to say 500 meters. But ideally, of course, I'd like to find the exact position such that that still is as low of a number as possible when we actually approach. and you can see we're bleeding off the velocity at closest approach. These engines are burning. So orbital mechanics is very confusing. This rendezvous and docking was, of course, another first for the American space program, and there one of the astronauts, again Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong, specifically had a degree in ended up with a degree, master's I think, in like orbital mechanics, because it is such a complicated and new topic. And you kind of had to go, have a way to bridge, because it's just math technically, but you need a way to bridge that math to kind of the intuition of how a pilot feels and what a pilot will do in trying to achieve those mathematical goals. And so, for example, if you're behind the other craft and trying to catch up to it, if you just, okay, well, we'll just burn our engines to try to catch up to it, that ends up putting you in a higher orbit and actually has the opposite of the intended effect. And so it's a very complicated problem. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, it seems paradoxical. It's a very confusing topic to get a practical grip on. And so there were lots of experts, including some of the atmosphere studied some of the astronauts studied the problem academically as well. And so it's worth you studying if you find it interesting at all as well. And there's a number of documentaries that discuss that. There's at least 2 or 3 documentaries I've seen that cover the wonders of the Gemini program. All right, so closest approach isn't too bad at all. Let's see if we can fine-tune it a little better. There's just so many numbers to keep an eye on. This is the challenge. Another reason why I was working on KOS and KRPC scripts is because I'd like to talk about the history and everything at the same time as the mission, but doing so is tricky, because you have to dedicate a certain chunk and type of your brain to one operation at the same time. I want to complete the mission I'm talking about and not just talk about a mission, a theoretical mission that I end up failing. So another way to do this, right now I'm just kind of changing how I'm angled. So the engines are always thrusting out the back, and I've just kind of changed how I'm pitched. Another way would be to use the other RCS thrusters to be able to just adjust for that. So that's another thing I'll try doing here. So it looks like hitting L is making that number lower. I am a space monkey. It also, because those thrusters aren't around the center of mass, unfortunately, I still have these off, right? Yeah. They cause the craft to change the orientation, not just their velocity and relative to that vehicle. So it kind of gives it a torque or a twist. So we're still fighting to stay under that. So it looks like we're at minimum 300 meters per second. Okay, so let's try a position over here. So that's not terrible, 340. So it looks like it's coming down when we're pitched over here. Good, so let's try a bit more. How much burn time? It says 3 minutes. Okay, so let's try it doing a bit longer of a burn and see. Of course, now it's already wandering the closest approach distance. So it also, you may have noticed that visually that moved. It's really interesting what what the KSP coders must actually end up having to do in order to allow us to use physical time warp and non-physical time warp in terms of the coordinate system of position and velocity. So closest distance to, closest approach. Ooh, I'm sorry, I really lost an eye on those numbers. Now I'm out to 1.5 kilometers at closest approach. So I'm kind of trying every direction here, and it doesn't look like anything's really bringing it down. Oh, maybe that did. Nope. No, really not successful. So we're not moving very fast relative to it at this point. Oh, relative velocity at closest approach. No, I'm just really failing at this. All right. So I did kill most of the velocity, so that's nice. So let's just see if one of these puff directions will bring us closer. Okay, it looks like that one will, but of course it's going to cause me to spin, but I'm okay with me spinning. Sure, why not, right? Okay, so oh, that brings it down 4 kilometers. Basically just, again, doing monkey things. Just hitting whichever button causes that closest approach distance to come down. So 3 kilometers isn't terrible. All right, so I'll wait until we're about 3 kilometers away from it. Also, I'm going to try to stop our roll by kind of puffing at the time such that it doesn't actually increase, basically undo the work that I just did. So 3 kilometers isn't too bad. That's a pretty good position to start from. Okay, so that's bringing the number down. Good to see. All right, and it's not too bad of a tumble we have now. We've taken off most of the velocity. So, of course, this was all an approximation. It's kind of calculated as an ideal burn, which we were certainly not doing. So match velocity at closest approach. So now that's going to suggest, okay, we wait 16 minutes to do a burn. So fair enough. Orbital rendezvous is very complicated. All right, so we are using physical time warp right now. And so I'm sure that made a bit of a bump on that number. Or physical. Sorry, of course, my brain forgot the term. Time to closest approach. It's estimating the burn time will be, can I trust that? 45 seconds? That seems a little short. So I'll come out of time warp, am I at 10x time warp? I think I am. Ooh, is it actually, no, 5x. Fair enough. 5x time warp, so let's go one notch further. I want to get that down to about a minute or two. 5, 4, 3, 2. All right. So now I want to go point in the desired direction. And because kind of the process of burning this RCS fuel to point myself in the desired direction will have some effect, I'll cancel this out and recalculate it. This is a bit easier of a calculation to make the get closer, null out your relative velocities calculation is easier to make than the original Hohmann one, so I have no qualms about erasing that. And, whoa, what? Intercept match velocities at closest approach. Get closer is the wrong one, sorry. I wanted match velocity at closest approach. All right, so now, so when we are at close, we're pretty close. Like, it's, I always think in mathematical functions, and I have to try to quickly think how to translate that. So as you approach the closest approach distance, that time, that minute, isn't going to have much effect on our actual close. Like, our relative positions were changing rapidly as we were approaching, and now we're kind of, as we're near this closest approach time, it's not going to be that much different, and then we're going to wander away from each other. So in practice, right now, I could kind of null out our velocities, and we're really not going to have much of an effect on closest approach. So let's just point this way, and then I can do the thing that we always want to do, which is, because we're quite close to each other right now, I could kind of ignore some of the more complicated effects I was talking about earlier, and I can just point directly at that craft and then burn towards it. And then the short amount of time, the relatively short amount of time it will take for me to cover most of those 3 kilometers to get closer to it, won't be terribly affected by the reference frame issues of the fact that we're in 2 different orbits. Because we're getting pretty close to the same orbit now, as we get closer and closer to each other, and closer and closer in both space, in position, and velocity. So now we're within 1 meter per second of each other. I'd say that is close enough. So now I really just want to target. So this symbol is showing us our, that's the retrograde of the velocity, or relative velocity vector. So in practice, I actually just want to point towards that other craft and puff my engine. Whoa. So in practice, I want to bring the yellow symbol and the purple symbol onto each other. And right now I'm doing that with the I, K, J, L buttons. And of course, because again, those, I probably should have looked at those before making this, starting this video. But hindsight is 20/20. In practice, you would want your RCS thrusters to be around the center of mass of your vehicle at this point. You would want to design the craft that way, and I did not. I've done some experiments with it. I'm not sure why I left them down here. In practice, I think if you're using these thrusters, it's obviously the thrusting is much closer to the center of mass. Right now, it's just mostly important that I point in that direction, and then I can just thrust the engine. I just use H. And then K a little bit, but see, hitting K kind of changes my rotation rate. Whereas if I'd used RCS balancer and put the RCS thrusters around the center of mass, then hitting I, K, J, and L would not have such an effect on my orientation. It wouldn't be changing my orientation so much. Okay, so now we're moving towards the target at 0.5 meters per second, which is abhorrently slow. And visually, you saw it jump there because I switched to time warp because I just want to wait until we orient ourselves back pointed towards it. So we can move towards each other gradually, but not this gradually. So when I design the vehicle from scratch, I do find this to be an enjoyable process. But because the RCS is so poorly balanced, my bad on this craft right now, it is not as enjoyable of a process. All right, there we go. So we got that pointed by just kind of burning the opposite of the way it had been pointed. And so closest approach distance still says, because we're closing the distance so slowly, we're not going to get that much closer before. It's ephemeral that the pink symbol and the yellow symbol, pointing towards the target, and our velocity vector relative to the target are pointed exactly the same, because those are going to wander relative to each other with time. And so in part that's a good place to start approaching the target, but it's not the ideal or not the exact solution. So now I'm just going to kind of lock myself to this position. So distance to target is slowly decreasing. Time to closest approach will be 7 minutes, and we will be 1 kilometer closer than we are right now. And of course those numbers are adjusting because it's puffing the RCS to make us hold this orientation. So now if I burn, so I also don't want to make the relative velocity to closest approach much higher, because the faster we get moving relative to our target to get closer, we're going to have to cancel that relative velocity out at the other end of the trip. So I don't want to let that to get more than, say, I don't know, 10 meters per second, let's say, 5 or 10 meters per second. So I do want to decrease distance to closest approach in the most ideal fashion, which is probably not what I'm doing right now. So just puff some of these. I just wish I had to rebalance the RCS. That is my bad. I'll have to do that on any future craft. Yeah, it's not going to be balanced any better on the Agena. But there we go. So I'm going to have, in 10 minutes, I'm going to have half the distance to this craft, which ain't bad. And relative velocity ain't bad. All right. So now what happens? What would it tell me if I say get closer? See, it's telling me to burn a lot. So if I change my velocity relative to the target by 24 meters per second, that's 24 more meters per second that I'm going to have to cancel out when we get there. So right now, that's not too bad. We're going to, over the next 9 minutes, we're going to get 2 kilometers closer. So that's not too bad. So also, ideally, it'd be nice to do the docking when we are on the daytime side of the Earth. So we have the beautiful sunlit Earth underneath us. So that's another good reason to wait just a little longer. Also, I should absolutely point out, so the issue we were having before, where we were seeing the closest approach distance changing when we use time warp, we're going to have that even worse or the same as we get closer to it. It's because of the way the reference system is set up. And so you don't want to rely on using time warp to get closer to it. You're going to want to minimize the number of times you go into and come out of time warp during this type of operation. Okay, so we're getting closer. In just a moment here. It'll be 3 minutes till we get closer. I'm just going to take a sip of water. So in the future, I will absolutely show designing a vessel which has the RCS balanced around the center of mass. Possibly even just adjusting this one to be that way. In practice, I will re-enable these because that should help. Because right now, all of my RCS thrust, so imagine the center of mass of this is like somewhere around here. I might even just be able to turn that on visually, but just imagine it. Because that's something you can't really see. So all of my thrust is below that, right? My RCS thruster is, I've got one here. These are actually RCS thrusters. So my RCS thrust is all at the center of mass or below it. And as a result, actually, I wonder if I just disable these four, if these are close enough to the center of mass, that would be good enough. But because these thrust out below the center of mass and there's nothing out here thrusting to counterbalance that, that causes the orientation to change when I'm just trying to have, make one of those other types of burns. All right, so 1 minute to closest approach. Closest approach distance is 1 kilometer. So if I use this type of warp, you see the craft jump like that, but it doesn't actually change the closest approach distance if I'm just in this sub-warp. Okay, so we're a minute away. That's good enough. So in practice, there would kind of be a better way of doing this, kind of by adding vectors. So right now, I'm doing it as 2 separate operations. First, I'm going to cancel out my velocity relative to that other craft, and then thrust towards it. In practice, you could add both of those operations up together. If you are smart enough to do that in your head, you can kind of guesstimate it, right? I could just kind of figure that out, but there might be tools for it as well. But right now, because the numbers are small enough, I'm okay, I'm comfortable just kind of doing one and then the other. So now I've mostly canceled out that relative velocity. I'm going to point towards the craft and start burning towards it again. Yeah, this would have been, it would have taken fewer of these operations to get really close to it if the RCS had been balanced around the center of mass. Then I could have made much more fine-tuned burns. Relative velocity at closest approach. Yeah, since we're just not moving very fast in relation to it in general. There we go, and now we're burning towards it, and if I increase my speed, we'll be closer. Let's see if I can get that down to under 100 meters per second. So just do a little tap there, no, a little bit. Okay, so let's just increase the speed a bit still. So one reason to say hit, I, K, J, L, to kind of just change the direction you're going without changing your speed, is that means that it will be less velocity to cancel out when we get there. So that would be an ideal way to fine-tune the approach if my RCS was better balanced around the center of mass. In this case, I don't have that advantage. Okay, let's get it below 100. All right, how much below 100 can I get just by mashing this button again and again? 50. Okay, that's not bad. 50 to 60 meters per second. Oh, and I went into real-time warp, but so you notice that changed the closest approach from 50, 60 to 70. So it always seems to kind of have like a 10% effect. But I'll be close enough that that's not so bad. So in part, hopefully you can see why I made this its own video. It's a very fine-tuned process that with my own music selected and everything, I find it to be an enjoyable and relaxing process. All right, so we are pretty close. You can actually make out the target now, right? You can see it as an extended body. We have science, but we don't have it intended to send back. So let's just keep that. All right, and we're going to we're getting towards that. Let's see, so let's try to adjust closest approach to get a little closer. 50, yeah, sure. So now we will try to hold this position, because right now we want to wait until we're close to this closest approach and then null out the speed. Get our relative velocity back down towards 0 again. And now we're approaching the point where we're going to have to worry about the orientation of the craft. We want them not to just be near each other, so now we've basically successfully rendezvoused. We're close enough that you can visually make out the target, which is awesome. The next tricky process will be to actually get into agreeable orientations so that the docking port on this craft can mate with the docking port on that craft. Alright, so nulling out the speed, 60 meters. You can really tell that we're in perpetual free fall now. with another. So these two vehicles, I just always find this very impressive. These two vehicles that we're seeing on screen were launched by entirely different rockets, are now in so close of orbits, so precisely matched that they can actually rendezvous and dock. And the space station does this, maybe, what is it, on average of maybe once a month, twice a month? Not with crew, but they send up supplies. They do the exact same thing. Well, not the exact same thing, but you know what I mean. They rendezvous and dock two craft that were launched at different times. Alright, so we're pretty close now, so let's null out the velocity just a little more. There we go, good enough. Within 0.1, we'll be fine for now. And orient towards target. Probably not doing that quite right. Nope. my guesses of which buttons will point me in the right direction are terrible at the moment. Alright, so we're just pointing ourselves kind of in the general direction of the target. We will be obviously wanting to thrust in that direction, but also we need to be oriented properly for the final approach for docking. And we are wandering in relation to each other still, of course. So if I point precisely at it right now, in a couple minutes, I will be very much not precisely pointed at it. So I'll call that good enough. So I'm doing this without cheating persistent rotation, or at least I'm trying to. Like I don't think persistent rotation has the ability it used to have to cheat it anymore. But right now I'm pretending like it doesn't. So it may take a frustratingly long amount of time because I need to kind of null out my own orientation changes and everything as well. So now, I'm close enough that I just hit the bracket, the square bracket keys on the keyboard, that it was able to switch me over. And I'll switch to this view, set as target to get the target data. All right, and I want to tell it to control from here. I don't think we're quite close enough to tell it to, oh, set as target, good. So now it's not just setting the overall craft as the target, we're close enough we're telling it to target a specific part of that craft. And MechJeb smartass here does have options for target, so relative velocity, target, so we want to go target minus, because if you imagine an arrow pointing out this docking port and an arrow pointing out that docking port, we don't want them to be aligned precisely with each other once everything is said and done. We want them to be pointed directly at each other, or anti-aligned. Oh, and anti-target. Oh, sorry, anti-parallel. Apologies. We don't want to be pointed away from the target. We want to be pointed anti-parallel. Those two paths. Because right now we're not directly pointed at each other, right? But we want to be pointed those two arrows such that they're anti-parallel. Alright, so that is currently the case, although that craft is still tumbling, so let's go switch to that one to do the same. And tell it target anti-parallel. And of course they're still both going to tumble a little bit as we're doing the final approach, and we're also still moving away from each other a bit. So I'll want to pull up, now this was kind of the general, I guess I should have just called this the rendezvous window, because there's more data that we're going to want for the final docking. So relative to target, we want docking guidance, angular not so much, but why not? Position and velocity. So I love how this is set up. By the way, absolutely love it, because it shows you don't have to think on the spot which key to press, they're labeled. So once you have them anti-parallel, of course if the RCS was balanced, what I'm saying would be true. Once you have the anti-parallel, you just kind of have to press the keys to get the numbers to do what you want them to do. So right now I'm just going to hit H and N to get us moving towards each other, or not moving away from each other in that dimension. So let's say look at the y-axis, so we're moving away from each other in the y-axis as well. So I'm hitting K in order to make it so we're actually moving towards 0. Really we want 0 for all of those numbers in the end, so I'm going to make it so that they are all moving towards 0. And as we kind of wobble around being precisely targeted, notice I've left this on. I've left ourselves anti-parallel. I think that only calculates once, by the way, so let me just, in part that's why I will use, I'll kind of cheat persistent rotation for operations like this. I can't even see the other target. Come on now, where am I? Maybe, no, I do have it targeted. All right, I think it only calculates the anti-parallelness when you set it, and then obtains that number, like it says, okay, this is anti-parallel for these two craft, it obtains that, and then it just stays there. Whereas in practice, the anti-parallel path, kind of anti-parallelness, changes with time. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the Gemini. Oh, there it is. Jeez. All right, so we're near each other. So this is maybe not ideal. Thankfully, we can still change orientations with relation to each other. Let's see. Let's just work on getting closer before we work on getting precisely anti-parallel. How about that? So let's point towards target. kind of tired of dealing with the unbalanced RCS of that. Even though this craft obviously has unbalanced RCS as well, I would expect it to, because the RCS ports are all along the bottom of this. So let's at least get ourselves moving towards each other. So see, this saying that, you know, this is how you're moving relative to the target doesn't say anything about these three dimensions, which are really what you want to get a handle on. Okay, so we are closing now, which is good. So we will stay pointed this way. Okay. Separation from target. There's another one I'd like to be showing, but I can't remember it offhand. Just surface, vessel, angular velocity. So we kind of want to null those out precisely so that we're not moving in relation to space, I guess. Like this will be our way of ensuring that we don't wander off of our current orientation while we're controlling the other craft. So I'm kind of, again, hitting buttons until those numbers are 0. It's a little mindless of a process, but like I said, I didn't say it was, you know, super mentally challenging. I said it was comforting, just calming. All right, so we're kind of holding the same position now, at least with this craft, and moving towards each other just a little bit, just slowly. So let's switch over to this craft, and so we're not moving directly down the line with each other. So let's go anti-parallel. If we were moving towards each other straight down the center axis of both craft, then this would pretty much be all we need to do, would just be to wait. Because the RCS is not centered, just the operation of pointing myself at the other craft has caused us to start moving away from each other, which is not ideal, which is not fun at all. All right, so let's null that out. But really, we're wandering. We always end up wandering in one of these other dimensions, not just the z-axis. If we could get precisely aligned along the x and the y, with RCS ideally balanced, that would be great. But that is not currently the case. So we're going to get closer. I don't know, if we haven't docked in maybe the next 5 minutes or so, I might cut this video again. But as you can see, it is quite a process, particularly if you have not, designed your vehicle ideally, as I have failed to do here. Right. So ideally, you want the RCS to be balanced around the center of mass, and you can do that with a mod in the VAB. You just want the part of the craft that you actually will have in orbit for the rendezvous and docking. And it's called RCS build aid. Okay, so let's work on getting that X number down. So those are relative numbers, right? Like if I was able to just point these craft really nicely at each other, the X and the Y would go to 0 just by design or definition. And everything would be in the Z-axis. Or Z. People say I pronounce that like an American, even though I'm Canadian, but I don't know. I think it's the true Canadian way is to not care which way you pronounce it, because we accept it both ways. Or at least that's what university taught me, which to the frustration of our many professors who are trying to learn the quote-unquote right, precise way to pronounce something in Canadian. I was like, oh, like one way you just said it was the Britishy way, one way is the more American way. We understand you perfectly with both, so there is no exact right way. At least I find, there's no value to being hoity-toity about that. So on the Z or Z axis, we would ideally just be thrusting forward and backwards. But ultimately that's just because pretty much everybody wants, you're already designed craft where your thrust is well balanced, is precisely balanced around your Z axis. Or else when you're thrusting up into space, you kind of, you lose control unless your engine had gimbal. Whereas balancing your RCS around the other dimensions is in practice a little more weird and tricky. So because I'm clearly rotating a bit, even though I've got a negative y target relative velocity, my y value is still increasing substantially. Yeah, we're not getting closer terribly fast, but it's just about getting control of these numbers, kind of getting them to move the way you want them to move. And of course, they're not necessarily doing that for me right now. I am kind of gaining a feel for them as I move on. Target relative angular velocity. Oh, interesting. It wasn't showing that from the previous craft. So let's see control from here. I don't know if I've actually told both set as target from both directions. Oh, and for some reason magically that went away. Maybe that's only calculated vessel to vessel, but not, say, part to part. So now we are getting closer, very slowly but surely. Really just want our orientations to be close to the same. Yeah, I think I will cut this, so, apologies. I was hoping to have this docked all of this video, but as you can see, it is a tricky process. In my next attempt, my next future launches, I will have the RCS balanced better in both craft. Even though it's, so now you've seen the Agena doesn't historically and realistically have RCS balanced around the center of mass. The Gemini should, so that's in part why the Gemini is the active vessel in a docking operation. So thanks for watching RP-0 America as we approach closer and closer between this Gemini, this crude Gemini capsule, and our Atlas Agena target vehicle. Goodbye.